We're really glad you're here to talk about raising up new leaders. And our purpose in this brief time is to really give you a quick snapshot as to some of the concepts that we're working on, some of the approaches we're working on, some suggestions that we have for you. And I hope you can think about this as the beginning of an ongoing dialogue. I think as both of us mentioned during the plenary session, our greatest information comes from you with respect to both your needs and your own experiences in leadership development. So we do hope that this represents an ongoing relationship for all of us. Our session goals are threefold. We are going to start out by establishing, if you will, a shared understanding of what we mean by effective Christian leadership, including some core competencies, if you will, or characteristics, and also some of the biblical principles and foundations of leadership. Then we're going to talk a little bit about culture and the role of culture in leadership development, and then finally some practical steps that hopefully you can take away to begin to pursue an environment of leadership development in your congregation. So let's start out with a definition of leadership. It's always good, I think, to get everybody on the same page. And I think as many people as in this room, you all have different definitions of leadership. But this one appeared several years ago in a Forbes magazine article, and for me, I thought it really captured the type of leadership that we're talking about for the church, and that is that it's a process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. And I really liked this definition for a couple of reasons. First of all, it focuses on influence versus authority or title or power, which is typically the case in a congregation. There's a heavy reliance on relationship, and specifically a reciprocal relationship between the leader and those being led, and then back from those being led to the leader. It talks about, the importance of managing people. I think the takeaway, if you will, is that managers manage things and leaders lead people. And that's what really comes to life in this definition. It also reaches beyond organizing the efforts of others to maximizing the efforts, to fully pulling all of the gifts that are available in order to fulfill God's purposes. And it includes an intended goal or outcome, and it doesn't depend on personality traits or attributes. There are lots of leaders, lots of kinds of leaders, and we want to honor that and reflect that in our definition. So I want to talk just a little bit about the dimensions of effective Christian leadership. And that really, I think, lays out what we're talking about with respect to what makes up a good leader within the church. And I call these the 4 C's. There's lots of different ways that writers have talked about the characteristics of leadership, but I think about character and conviction and competency and what I'll call convergence. And let me spend just a minute talking about what I mean here, and then I'll go back and visit each one in a little bit more detail. But character is really what generates trust on the part of followers. And conviction helps others to embrace a shared purpose. And competency helps the congregation to function as a healthy community. And then finally, convergence, I think, represents the coming together of a leader, a congregation, a time, a place, a ministry opportunity, and the resources to realize God's purposes. So let me unpack each one of these a little bit more. First, character. And here, I think who a person is determines how they're going to lead. So in the church, character and the character of the leader is very, very important, I believe. And essentially what we are talking about here is the character of Christ living in the Christian leader. And we need look no further than the life of Christ to understand what we mean by that. It's a life of close relationship with God through prayer. It's a life empowered by God through trust in God. It's a life of compassion towards others, through relationship and service. And it's a life that's rooted in God's Word. Also, life experiences form leaders. Your own personal journey of faith, your own personal set of circumstances and relationships that you've had in your life will have a big impact on the type of leader that you are and the character of your leadership. So don't take anything away from life experiences. They are a very important part of leadership formation. And then finally, emotional intelligence plays a role. And what I mean by this is a sense of self-awareness, a social awareness, the ability to manage relationships, and the ability actually to manage yourself. Second is conviction. And leaders essentially are shaped by their vision of God's kingdom and the church's mission. And so effective Christian leaders, they possess a conviction that arises out of their relationship with God. And when you think about strong leaders that you have encountered, I think you would probably agree with me that they have a sense of conviction that you can feel. You can experience that sense of conviction. They believe certain things deeply, and they commit themselves selflessly to the purpose and the shared vision, both for themselves as well as for those that they are leading. Third is competency, and here we're talking about skills that can be learned. These are oftentimes the same skills that are learned in other sectors that those that have experience in other leadership positions bring to the table. And I think importantly, competencies are not unique to Christian leaders, but they are necessary for their formation. And we don't certainly want to ignore those, although we also don't want to make this the sum total of leadership within the church. And examples here are things like the dynamics and processes of change, elements of conflict resolution, win-win problem-solving techniques, and a variety of other competencies. We are fortunate in that we already have a growing body of work through the church leader tools that are addressing a lot of these different competencies, and that will continue to grow over time. So there are already a lot of resources available, and that body of work again will continue to grow over time. And finally, we have convergence. And here I think this just recognizes that Christian leadership is exercised in a particular time and in a particular place. And it is often unique and it's often unrepeatable. And that Christian leaders, they acknowledge this fact. They acknowledge that oftentimes they are in the right place at the right time. I kind of think of this as describing a kairos versus a chronos moment. It's a time where God has placed a particular leader in a particular situation to fulfill a purpose. So it's not a matter of formulas or steps necessarily, but it's a matter of gift and a matter of grace. And then finally, convergence helps leaders be humble and be flexible. And I think, this explains in some cases why the same person is not equally effective in all situations. So again, we have our 4 C's that really make up the dimensions of effective Christian leadership. I want to say a word about essence and style, and that is that I believe the essence of Christian leadership is the same in all times and in all places. It's derived from whom we follow and from whom we are trying to build our character, if you will. But style depends on the individual, and it depends on the situation. And in fact, well-developed leaders can exercise different styles in different situations depending upon who they're leading and the environment in which they're leading. So there are a lot of different styles. There's things like a coach or a visionary or a pace setter or a democratic type leader. But style can shift, but the essence of leadership, I believe, remains the same for all Christian leaders. So I'm going to quickly hand this over to Stuart, who's going to provide some biblical background with respect to leadership.
Yep, thanks Candy. Thanks Candy. So Candy has set a foundation for leadership. We want to move on then to think a little bit about that foundation for building up leaders and raising up leaders. And there are many, many examples in Scripture. I've taken 2, one from the Old Testament in the book of Exodus, where we find Moses being the primary leader, doing all the judging and all the leading and all the deciding. And his father-in-law, Jethro, comes to him, and this is an exceptional verse. What is this that you are doing for this people? Why do you sit alone while all the people stand? He goes on and makes a statement to him that is a statement that applies to some leaders and some more so than others. What you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. There are some folks, you maybe, or others in your congregations or in other leadership settings, that need to write this passage down and, like Blaise Pascal did, pin it on the inside of your clothing so you remember it. You might need to write it down and put it in your pocket or put it where you will see it regularly, because what you are doing is not good. You are wearing yourself out and you are wearing your people out. The task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it, should not do it alone. And then Jethro goes on to give him some very, very simple advice. And it is a miracle all by itself. This is his father-in-law. I mean, how many times do son-in-laws take advice from their father-in-law? But he listens to Jethro's advice. And Jethro's advice is to bring some other leaders into this leadership system. So we hear, go look for some men, in their case, we would say people, some people who fear God, who have this relationship with God, who are trustworthy, who hate dishonest gain, and set them over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Bring some other leaders into this system. And the people, this brand new forming Jewish community, do this, and they are blessed by raising up leaders. And they go to their homes in peace. So that's a scriptural foundation, a wonderful passage for us. Old Testament. Another corresponding scripture passage that has a wonderful message is also found in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. There are not enough leaders, not enough disciples to carry out the ministry, and in this particular case, it's widows who are going neglected in the daily distribution of food. And the disciples are so wise to listen to this concern, and their response is, it is not right that we should neglect the Word of God that they have been given as some of the original disciples in order to wait on tables to help out in this situation. So they do the same thing we see in the birth of the Old Testament, the Jewish community, they do in the birth of the New Testament community. They raise up some new leaders. 7, again, they happen to be men. In our context, we would say people to lead in this way. And many have pointed out that it is probably not accidental that the first martyr in the Christian church, of course, except for Jesus, is not Peter or John, the beloved disciple, or any of the original disciples. It's Stephen, one of these 7 additional leaders who is raised up. So we need to raise up leaders, as they did in both of those contexts. And so those are 2 scriptural foundations to build on. A third foundation is our Lutheran foundation, of course, very, very present for us with the 500th anniversary coming up. Luther called it the priesthood of all believers, that each and every one of us are ministers, are priests in our own way. He says in the Christian Nobility and in other writings, in fact, we are all consecrated priests through baptism, and then quotes 1 Peter. You are a royal priesthood, a priestly kingdom. Each and every one of us ought to rise to that level of leadership that we are capable of. So we have some foundations here for raising up leaders. I'm going to pass it back to Candy and talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so where do we start? Where do we start to try to develop leaders within the church? And I include in that lay leaders within the church. And I suggest that it's with your culture. With your culture. Culture is powerful. Peter Drucker, who's a business guru, once said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what he basically meant by that is that you can have all the best plans in the world, you can have all of the resources that you need, but if you do not have the culture to make it happen, you will not be successful. So I suggest that you start with culture. And basically, the absence of a leadership development culture leads to exhaustion and to burnout. I mentioned this just a little bit before in the plenary session. But without culture, we miss things like the identity and the intention and the intensity around leadership development. Culture, for us, represents the why behind our action to develop leaders. It also is the conviction to pursue the development of leaders. And then it's also the resources to make that a reality. So again, it's the why, and it's the conviction, and then it's the resources that are necessary to make it a reality. And basically, leadership development in that context of culture development is everybody's responsibility. I think that Stuart has very clearly articulated from Scripture the need of the multiplying effect, the need of raising up leaders who can raise up other leaders, and that it is everyone's responsibility, not just the pastor's responsibility or the rostered leader's responsibility. And so when you think about what your personal responsibility is in raising up new leaders and in supporting a culture of leadership development, maybe one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is, if you're on a member of your leadership council at your congregation, or you're leading a team, or you're leading some type of ministry effort, what is your personal succession plan? Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about someone else who you are serving with that ultimately could take your place? And then how are you going to help them develop in order to do that? And you might say, well, I never want to leave this ministry. I want to lead this ministry for the rest of my life. I don't hear that very much. What I normally hear is, you told me it was only going to be a year and I'm at 5 now. But the beauty of all of that is, it not only gives that individual an opportunity to be developed as a leader, it gives them an opportunity to lead a ministry that they might not have ever been given that opportunity, and it gives you an opportunity to go lead a new ministry. And so think about it. If you're on church council, who can you identify in your congregation, even if you're 5 years out from going off of council, that you can start to think about nurturing and identifying and developing in order to move into council? And this isn't even an individual, it's an individual decision, but it's also a collective decision in terms of who out there can you begin to work with to raise up as a leader. And sometimes it'll be people that they don't think of themselves as a leader, but they are, or they have the potential to become one. So just think about that a little bit. And also, leadership development really benefits everybody. All people have the potential to behave as leaders, even if they're not in a leadership position, or even if they don't believe they have any gifts for leadership, or they never want to be in a leadership position. I think everyone can benefit from much of what is entailed in leadership development. As I mentioned this morning, there are really 3 elements to a process, if you will, or a structure of developing leaders within a congregation. And culture by itself is not enough. Obviously, we need to rely on some structure and processes in order to help individuals develop as leaders. And so I refer to this as the 3-legged stool, one of knowledge and of experience and of mentoring. And I'm going to talk very briefly about this now. First of all, on knowledge, I really think that in terms of this first leg of the stool, we're talking about 2 different types of knowledge. We're talking about the knowledge of what it means to be a follower of Christ. As I mentioned before, Christian leadership development is an integral part of discipleship formation. And to the extent we try to separate it, we are going to create leaders that are not following in the way of Christ. So we really have to keep this grounded in discipleship formation. So we want to create opportunities for leaders to be involved in prayer and in regular worship and in service and study and stewardship and in relationship and service opportunities. So that's one aspect of knowledge in the development of leaders, and that is what it means to be a follower of Christ. And then secondly, what do they need in order to be a competent leader? As I mentioned before, one of the C's was competency. These are things that can be learned that are not unique to Christian leaders, but that are important for them to be effective. Here we're talking about focusing on character development and skills development, and focusing on both transformation of the individual and not necessarily just on performance. But when we're talking about the knowledge to be a competent leader in particular, we're thinking of things like visioning and collaboration and people development and stewardship of resources under their care. So knowledge really has 2 important components in terms of the development of a leader. Second, we have experience. And here, I think there is great value in showing people a pathway, showing people a way in which your congregation is going to invest in them and in their development as a leader. And I might suggest that leaders find great value in ministry experience itself. There's nothing like being out and experiencing leadership development in a ministry setting rather than in a head and book setting. And at the same time, it's important to think about what is that pathway, what some people call it a leadership pipeline. Basically, how are we going to move people through a process of some sort that provides them opportunities to examine themselves as leaders, to be coached and mentored as leaders, and to give them the knowledge that they need in order to take on increasing leadership responsibility. And here then we begin with what it takes to actually lead yourself. Again, everyone can benefit from leadership behavior, what it takes to lead others and what it takes to lead leaders. So again, it benefits everyone, even if it's only about leading yourself. So that pathway or pipeline is an important concept to develop. And then finally, we have mentoring, the third leg. And here we're really talking about that reciprocal leadership point that I made earlier, in that leadership development is really relational. And those same ministry experiences can provide teachable moments to individuals in terms of their own leadership skills and how to improve those skills. And here we're talking about mentoring, and that mentoring and being a mentee, both of those are skills that can be learned and developed and nurtured on the part of both those that are mentoring and those that are being mentored. And it's skills like walking with instead of in front of someone, or learning how to partake in active listening and probing questions, and measuring one's success by the success of others, and being curious and engaged and willing to step out of your comfort zone. So these are the three legs that really make up a leadership development structure and process within your congregation. And when married to a culture of leadership development, can be very effective in bringing forth new leadership within your congregation. I'm going to pass it back over to Stuart, who's going to talk about some practical steps now.
And she set me up so good. The next church leader tool is on the leadership pipeline, and the next one after that is on leadership succession. So I was like, yes, we're right on. So what I want to do is now to offer some practical examples of leadership, raising up leaders in your context. And it'll be different in each context, but building on some of these, we wanted to throw out some things for you to think about in your context. So first, 6 practical next steps for you in your own leadership to raise up leaders. So the first thing is to grow yourself as a leader. For you to grow, and Candy has mentioned already the church leader tools. There is a church leader tool, and in your notes is a link to that church leader tool. It's called Leaders Are Learners, and it has numerous examples in there of how to grow yourself as a leader. So then the next step, or the next practical idea, is then to share that. Obviously, if you are not growing yourself, you're not reading or watching videos or learning yourself, then you don't have anything to pass on. But when you read a good article, when you watch a good video, when you read a good book, when you have a good conversation with somebody, then you can pass those ideas on to somebody else. So share that with somebody else that you know needs those same skills. Join a Bible study or a small group, a place where you are growing as a disciple. As Candy highlighted already, the discipleship and the leadership process go so well together. So get together with some other folks, or start one if there isn't one in your context, or look for one in your area or in your congregation where you are growing as a leader and a disciple yourself. Then use opportunities to teach leadership. As you're learning and you're growing, where in your congregation, at church council, at committee meetings, at gatherings of leaders or committees or teams, where are there some opportunities to teach and share some of the things that you're learning and growing with other folks? So look for those. It's different in each congregation, but there are places where you can teach and share leadership with other folks. Learn to delegate. This goes exactly to what Candy was talking about in terms of experience. If you are keeping everything like Moses was, then nobody else has the opportunity to learn and grow. So learn to delegate. Again, there is a church leader tool on this topic of delegation. The why do that? The who, and then the how of delegation. So it's a 3-part church leader tool to learn how to delegate and share with other folks to give them the opportunity to have that experience. And then a 6th suggestion, mentor and disciple leaders. Again, that goes to exactly what Candy was describing, to come alongside of another leader and to help them grow. Again, there is a church leader tool on that very topic, on leadership development, how to come alongside of somebody else and help them grow as a leader. I mentioned briefly in my introduction this morning that I had some great leaders in my life and what I learned of leadership. And Bob John, my scoutmaster, is the reason I'm the leader I am. Because Bob would have me over his house. He would talk about things that I was doing well as the senior boy leader in my troop and the things that I needed to learn and grow in. And I would not be a leader if it had not been for Bob to come alongside and to mentor me and to help me grow. So come alongside of somebody else, or if you need that, find somebody to come alongside of you and to help them to grow. So these are things that you can personally do. Now let's talk a little bit about congregationally. What can you do in your congregation? And of course, many of those things are things that will play out in the life of your congregation. But there are some other things you can do as a congregation. Find a way for people to join ministries. In some churches, for someone to get involved is a very difficult process. The one handout that I gave you is what we use in my congregation. In my particular setting, we've decided that all of our ministries will have a quarterly schedule. Ushers, greeters, set up communion, distribute communion, clean up after communion, the folks that help out in numerous different ways, all the things listed on that handout. We do that quarterly, and then every couple weeks before the quarter changes over and the new schedule is made, we put those insert in the bulletin and we give folks the opportunity both to step out if they are going on vacation. We have one woman that she just always reminds us, I'm spending the summer away. So she steps out of a schedule and then the fall comes and she steps back in. So find some way in your context to allow people to step out and, more importantly, to step in and to get involved. So some method for people to join ministries. Develop some new ministries where folks can be involved. Some great examples are lay visitors, folks who go out and visit in your context. In my context, I go to visit our shut-ins and our nursing home patients every other month, and one of our lay visitors goes. I put out an invitation, I invited some folks, I trained those folks up, and now they go and do that, and they're developing wonderful relationship with those folks. In other contexts, a worship assistant is a way for somebody to get involved. I love having lay preachers. I'm headed off on vacation in a couple weeks, and I'll have lay preachers who will be sharing, and it has changed the faith of some of the lay preachers I've worked with in the past for the opportunity to preach. So develop some new ministries for people to be involved with. Create training videos for those ministries. I gave you a link to one of the YouTube videos that we use in our context for training, and the one I gave you is for visitors. So when I gathered a group of our initial new visitors, I knew that I was going to have more people who would be interested in the future. So I videotaped the training, and now I just sent one 2 weeks ago to a lady who was interested. I said, here, watch this YouTube video, and then we'll have some conversation about this. And if you feel like, well, I don't know how to videotape and put that on YouTube, what do? Ask anybody who's good at it. Raise up a leader. Find somebody who's got that skill, a young person or an older person, and have them use their gifts, delegate that task off to them. I want to do some training. Can you video record that and put that on a YouTube or GodTube or something for me? So you have that training that you can pass on to the next person. So find a way as well for folks to be involved in the committees and the teams of your congregation. This was a problem that we were struggling with just recently in my context. We realized that our teams, our committees, were slowly having people who left or moved or passed away, and we weren't adding new folks. So I gathered a couple leaders and said, let's develop a process. We figured out we have the date on the calendar already, early in September. We're going to get together. We're going to pass out church directories. We have a letter that's all written, and we have a whole process to invite a whole new group of folks to be involved in the teams and the leadership teams within your context. Extending from that, having a really good nominating process is helpful. A process that is repeatable, that is, it's written down. I was thinking about this partly because I had a conversation with my mother-in-law. She's part of a great congregation. She's just getting off of church council, and she said, me and the other guy who are coming off, we're the nominating committee. and we don't know what to do. They have no process that's in writing, no idea. They just make it up each year. Well, come on, you can do better than that. Put a couple people together, decide how you want to create a really good process. It probably should have some written responsibilities so that when you invite someone to be on church council or another leadership group, you have it all written down. Have a letter that here's our letter that we're going to send out. Have some goals about variety. We want some racial variety. We want some age variety. We want some variety of life and the length of time in the church. And then keep records. One of the things we do in my context is we write down who we've invited, especially, and this happens in most contexts, somebody will say, oh, work is just awful now. I'd be interested in church council, but not at the moment. If you don't write that down, they're gone forever. We write it down, and then next year we'll say, well, you said work was bad last year. Is this a better year? So keep those records. Or the person who goes, I will never be on church council ever. Well, write that down. So have a good process in writing so that you can do that effectively year after year and improve it year after year. And last, a great idea is to form a leadership small group. Gather some leaders together. Again, there's a church leader tool on this topic called Super Simple Leadership Development. It was an idea I got from a great leader of leaders. He gathers together a small group. They study a book together. Once a month they gather and they discuss that book. So that's a great way to grow and raise up leaders within your context. So a lot of practical ideas. I know it's throwing lots of stuff out, but there's lots of resources in there, so check them out. We'll let Candy wrap up with some final thoughts.
Okay, I just want to reiterate a couple of what I believe to be important truths. And the first is that I think Christ's church needs strong leadership, not a strong leader. There was a quote I saw once that I thought really brought this to life, and that is that if the pastor is the superstar, the church is an audience and not a body. And we are in a body. The body of Christ and then the body of our individual congregations. And it is really everyone's responsibility to come together to think about leadership development, to think about a culture that encourages leadership development, and to walk with others in that development process and to walk ourselves through improvement as a leader. Also, leadership development requires conviction, it requires intention, it requires intensity. I've worked with some congregations where a light bulb goes off in just, we never even thought about leadership development. It never occurred to us that we needed to be doing anything in this area. And then how to really, with intentionality, tackle it. How are we going to create the structure? How are we going to create the culture that's going to enable us to really begin to identify and to raise up leaders, not only for today, but for tomorrow? And then finally, I mentioned my dream of the church being a locus for leadership development as we move forward. I think what's particularly important is leadership development around younger people. I remember being in a conference with the bishop one time, and he said, "This is great, but look at all the white hairs out here." And I really think that leadership development in a congregation is a terrific opportunity to bring in and to engage youth who really are at a time in their life where they would benefit from leadership development. There's no greater joy that I would have in this ministry than to have an individual who's been in the congregation for a period of time be sitting across the table from their boss at their workplace, and for their boss to say to them, you know, you really show the capacity for leadership. Where did you learn some of the skills that you can show us now and you've demonstrated with respect to leadership? And that individual would turn and say, oh, I learned it in my church. That's, I think, the promise that we have of leadership development for a variety of individuals, but particularly when we think about our youth and we think about the kinds of leaders that we want to have in the world, Christian leaders in the world. I think there's tremendous promise there.